My name is David Gariff. I'm a senior lecturer here, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about art and weather. And in fact, this is a lecture that relates to our current exhibition that is now on view, which is titled True to Nature, Open Air Painting in Europe, 1780 to 1870. This talk is not an overview of the exhibition, so this is not a talk that will replace attending the exhibition. You'll still want to attend the exhibition. My talk is going to be a little bit different. It's going to actually talk more about weather, the approach to weather in art, and how it moves from an approach that could best be termed symbolic to an approach that you'll see represented in the exhibition, which is more what we might call empirical or scientific. So that's what I'm really here today to talk to you about. In the exhibition, it's an exhibition of small, for the most part, oil sketches on paper. They derive from the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and it essentially is trying to chart for you the beginnings of what we call open air painting, when artists actually went outside to look at the landscape, the sky, etc., to do sketches. This activity at the end of the 18th century was centered in and around Rome. Artists from all European countries came to Rome, and then they sort of fanned out into what we call the Roman Campagna, the countryside, to find these lovely views. And then, in fact, they even moved further south to Naples, down into Calabria, and then they, in fact, crossed over often into Sicily. And what they were attempting to do was to capture the fleeting effects of sky, clouds, and in many ways weather out in the open air. The exhibition features about 100 works and from a variety of different artists. As I said, they're all small works. They're works on paper. They would have been painted for the most part by an artist sitting out in nature on a stool and having his paint box on his lap and using the top of his paint box as his support. I'll show you an example of that as we go along. Most of these works were actually destroyed because they were thought of just as sketches. Very rarely were they actually signed works, and none of them really were intended to be exhibited. So it represents a very important chapter in open air painting that in some ways presages and sets the foundation for later Impressionism. As the Impressionists begin to go outside and paint in the open air, we're probably more familiar with that. But they owe a great debt to these artists that are represented in this exhibition. But as I said, my talk is not about the exhibition per se. It's about the Western artists' engagement with the outdoor effects of light and atmosphere and natural phenomena of wind and rain, snow, in effect what we call, for lack of a better term, weather. And as I said, I hope to trace this influence, this interest from a more symbolic approach ultimately to the kind of scientific approach that's represented in the exhibition. So let's get started. The best place to begin is in the beginning. So when we talk about the idea of weather in many ways, we can go all the way back to the place where it first really appears as a topic or as a subject, and that would certainly be in the Bible, in the Old Testament, and more specifically in the first chapter of Genesis. What I'm showing you here is a Psalter. It's a book of hours. It's a French book of hours from around 1243. It's the hours of Guy Louis Boileau, who's from France. This is today at the Morgan Library and Museum in New York City. And on the left, you see 4 images that I then show you on the right in greater detail. And if we look at those 4 images, the upper left image is a depiction of a creation scene from the day 1 of Genesis. So Christ stands there with this nimbus halo, his right hand holding and referring to this disc. And that disc or sphere or orb is just a disk that it's enclosing a series of colored dots, which you maybe can see better on the right. That would relate to Genesis 1, 1 to 2. Then in the upper right and in the lower left, those two go together. The upper right image and then the lower left image is probably the creation scene on the second day. Christ again standing with his hand raised and with this orb that's divided now into firmament and waters. So now there's a division between the firmament, the heavens, and the waters. So this would be Genesis 1, verses 6 through 8. And then in the lower right, which is the creation scene on the third day, because now we can begin to see little plants peeking up. This is Christ again standing there dividing the firmament and the earth. And so we see these three little trees with some water. That's again Genesis 1. So let's just go through some of those passages. In Genesis, day 1, we find this phrase or this passage. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. Then in day 2, the passage that would be pertinent, then God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." Thus God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. And God called the firmament heaven. And then day 3, in the lower right, would pertain to this passage. Then God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters he called seas. In essence, that little orb or sphere we might think of as a sort of self-contained weather system in many ways. And that idea continues when we look at this painting on the right, which takes us now into the Renaissance. And this is a painting by Hieronymus Bosch. It is the famous triptych, The Garden of Earthly Delights, that's in the Prado from around 1500. I'm sure you're familiar with the interior panels. There are 3 scenes, one of earth and then flanked by heaven and hell. But this is the altarpiece when it is closed, not open. So to reveal those other scenes, you would have to open up this panel here, these 2 panels, to reveal the scene that you're probably more familiar with. And what we have here is exactly the same concept of this kind of creation scene in this kind of orb of atmosphere and weather. In fact, up here is God, this tiny little figure in the cosmos, which is all dark. And across the top, there's an inscription, which isn't Genesis, it's Psalm 33. And what it says is, quote, "For he spake, and it was done. He commanded, and it stood fast." So that's the inscription across the top of those two panels. This is probably representing the third day again, because we begin to see in the Bosch painting the presence of plant life beginning to sort of emerge from this from the waters. So this concept of weather and this kind of self-contained orb, it has a very long history. It's tied especially to Genesis. Here is the prophet Jeremiah on the left by Michelangelo from the Sistine Chapel, the ceiling. This dates to 1508 to 1512. And I'm comparing it, rather strangely, to a painting on the right by Frederick Church, the American painter. It's called Beacon, off Mount Desert Island. It dates to 1851. It's in a private collection today. Certainly Jeremiah in the Old Testament rails about the effects of light and atmosphere and wind and sea. So in Jeremiah 10, verses 12 to 13, he says, "It is he who made the earth by his power, who established the world by his wisdom, and by his understanding stretched out the heavens. When he utters his voice, there is a tumult of waters in the heavens, and he makes the mist rise from the ends of the earth. He makes lightning for the rain, and he brings forth the wind from his storehouses." That's Jeremiah. But we find similar ideas in the New Testament, especially in Matthew 16, 2 to 3, where we read, "He answered them, 'When it is evening, you say, it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, it will be stormy today, for the sky is red and threatening. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times.'" That's in Matthew. Now, what's interesting is this phrase, "It will be fair weather, for the sky is red, and in the morning it will be stormy today, for the sky is red and threatening." We today have the modern proverb that comes down to us, and it probably comes from this passage in Matthew, which is, of course, "Red sky at night, sailors delight. Red sky at morning, sailors take warning." So that passage about trying to monitor the weather and whether it's a good day to be out on the seas probably, in fact, comes from that passage in Matthew. Now, in terms of the Frederick Church, as I said, this is a painting from 1851. In 1850, Church went to Mount Desert Island in Maine because he had heard that the marine views, the sea and the sky, were just spectacular there, among the finest in the country, people had told him. And that's what he wanted to experience. This is one of the great paintings from that time in Maine. This was very favorably received by the critics. One critic wrote about it that, quote, "The whole illimitable expanse of sky and ocean is opened to your astonished eyes." So just in this kind of comparison between the writings of Jeremiah, the Old Testament, the writings of Matthew, the New Testament, and coming towards Frederick Church long after that, thousands of years later, we sort of encapsulate here this movement from weather interpreted in more symbolic ways to an artist who's literally trying to come to terms with the empirical facts of weather and sky and rain and sea, etc. But this is a path we can trace both in the visual arts and also in literature, and I'll make some references to literature in a few minutes. Staying with some paintings that are in our permanent collection, here's a painting on the left that we used to give to Tintoretto. We no longer give it to Tintoretto. In fact, we don't give it to an Italian anymore. We think it's a Dutch painting by a man named Lambert Sustras. It's Christ at the Sea of Galilee on the left from the 1570s. And another painting that's from our permanent collection, although I venture to say most people don't really seek it out, it's in the room, the 18th century Italian room, where we have Tiepolo and Panini. This is by Alessandro Magnasco. It's another portrayal of Christ at the Sea of Galilee, but this is from the 18th century, 1740s. So when we talk about sort of the symbolic aspects of weather, certainly the Bible, biblical storms, and especially storms at sea, are particularly relevant. But those storms very often are symbolic in the sense that it's not just about a storm, it's about a storm that is some kind of test of faith. It has some kind of connection to God providing protection for his people, or protection from natural storms, or causing natural storms to destroy people. So they could be a personal crisis of an apostle, whatever. So there's a symbolism normally attributed to the storm. So in Matthew 14, 28 to 32, this is the actual passage that relates to Christ on the Sea of Galilee, when the apostles see Jesus and he says, "Come to me," and then Peter says, "Well, I'd have to walk on water, but if you're a man of faith, go ahead." And then Peter sort of panics. So here's the passage. It's Matthew 14, 28 to 32. And you can see Peter in both of these slides beginning to sort of exit the boat. And Peter answered him and said, "Lord, if it be thou, bid me come up unto thee upon the waters." And he said, "Come." And Peter went down from the boat and walked upon the waters to come to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, saying, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus stretched forth his hand and took hold of him, and saith unto him, "O thou of little faith, wherefore didst thou doubt?" And when they were gone up into the boat, the wind ceased. So that's the passage of the very famous event where Peter attempts to come to Jesus on the waters. There's another storm at sea that relates to the apostles. It's not this particular episode. It's when Jesus and the apostles are all in a boat together, and then a storm comes up. And this is in Matthew 8:24-26. Suddenly, a furious storm came up on the lake, so that the waves swept over the boat. But Jesus was sleeping. The disciples went and woke him, saying, "Lord, save us, we are going to drown." He replied, "You of little faith, why are you so afraid?" Then he got up and rebuked the winds and the waves, and it was completely calm. Now that is another subject that's often portrayed by painters. It's not the one you see here, which is about Peter, but it's the painting that you see here on the left by Rembrandt. This is Rembrandt's painting of the storm on the Sea of Galilee from 1633. This is the painting that was stolen from the Isabel Stewart Gardner Museum, and it's never been located. So that theft was in 1990. This painting is still missing. So if you see it turn up on the Antiques Roadshow, you'll know, yeah, I'll buy it. You'll probably get it really cheap. The painting on the right is our painting from the National Gallery of the Mill by Rembrandt from 1645. So another passage that relates to the story I just mentioned of Jesus and the disciples in the boat is also told in Mark chapter 4, 39-41. And it ends in the same way that the passage that I just read in Matthew ends. It ends by saying, talking about Jesus, and quote, "He woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, 'Peace, be still.' Then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm, and they were filled with great awe and said to one another, 'Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?'" So that tells the same story slightly differently in Mark as opposed to Matthew. So again, this storm at sea is very important, obviously owes a lot to biblical sources. The Rembrandt mill on the right is interesting because in fact it shows a storm, but it's a storm that is passing. Rembrandt probably based this scene on his father's mill up on the ramparts of Leiden. And of course, for most of the history of this painting, especially later after the 17th century into the 18th and 19th centuries, people approached this painting thinking that it was a very, very dark and moody and romantic painting. And the basic reason they believed that it was because the painting was dirty. And it was under many layers of yellowed varnish and dirt. So for example, when Turner saw this painting in the 19th century when it was in London, he did not see it the way that we're looking at it today. It was to him a very dark and brooding and romantic and rather threatening painting. When we had acquired the painting in 1977, we decided it was a big decision. All the eyes of the world were upon us. We decided to clean the painting. So it was cleaned between 1977 and 1979. And lo and behold, the storm was in fact a blue sky. And the storm was passing off to the left, which gave us a completely different interpretation of the painting. The symbolism is rather positive as opposed to negative. The storm is passing. The storm clouds have passed, and there are clear skies ahead for the ships that one sees. So again, this had a long history of being interpreted in a particular way. In the case of the mill, it was specifically given this rather dark and foreboding interpretation, though for the most part because it was particularly dirty. But the idea of the what we call in Romantic literature and art the storm-tossed boat. There's an entire literature in Romanticism, both in poetry, literature, and painting, about the image of the storm-tossed boat. So here we see a French romantic, Delacroix. These are two paintings by Eugène Delacroix, Christ on the Sea of Galilee, 1841 on the left. That's in the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City. And on the right, same subject, Christ on the Sea of Galilee, Delacroix from 1854. That's at the Walters in Baltimore. This subject in 19th century Romanticism, even when it comes from a biblical source, is appropriated by the Romantics as more symbolic of their own personal storms, that they are these figures themselves that suffer from a kind of emotional approach to life, the sort of Byronic romantic hero. So in Byron and in Shelley and in Keats, think of the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. This image of the storm-tossed boat, the storm-threatened boat, in other words, weather that's very forbidding and very foreboding, is a common, it turns into a kind of stock romantic theme. Now, here are two paintings that are exactly of the same subject, although I guess you wouldn't know it by just looking at them. And they pit against each other the two great names in 17th century Northern Baroque painting, that is Rubens against Rembrandt. We always talk about those two artists as sort of in comparison. So on the left is Rubens' stormy landscape with Philemon and Baucis from 1625. That's in the Kunsthistorische Museum in Vienna. And then our painting on the right of the same story, Philemon and Baucis from 1658 by Rembrandt on the right. This is a very small painting that's in our Rembrandt galleries. It's a beautiful painting. This is a painting that actually looks so dark you think it is dirty, but in fact it's not. It's in pristine condition. It's just a very, very deeply shadowed work by Rembrandt. So here we don't have a biblical storm, we have a mythological storm. So now, even in the realm of mythology, the story of Philemon and Baucis comes from Ovid, the Metamorphoses. And it's the story of this elderly couple in Phrygia, Philemon, the husband, Baucis, his wife, who are very poor, live by themselves in this small little cottage. And one day the gods Zeus and Mercury come to visit this town, but they're disguised as beggars. And they go from door to door throughout the town and ask people in each home if they can provide them with some food and some shelter, that they're poor, they're destitute, as they go from house to house. And in each case, they're rebuffed by the owner of the home. They're told to go away. They're about to leave, and then as they approach the outskirts of the town, they see a little cottage that they hadn't approached yet. So that's the cottage of Philemon and Baucis. So they go again to the door, they knock, they say the same thing, we're poor, can you help us, give us some food? And here, Philemon and Baucis, who are incredibly destitute, they have very little themselves, invite these two beggars into their home, and they set the table and they provide them with all manner of what they have, which isn't very much. They have a little bit of wine in a pitcher, and as Baucis is pouring it out, she starts to notice that when it gets empty, it miraculously refills, and she can keep pouring out this wine, and she thinks clearly something's up with that. They have a goose, and they actually say, we can slaughter this goose for you. It's the only goose that we have. And the gods say, no, that's okay. you can keep your goose. In any case, finally, the gods reveal themselves, that they're not these beggars, but that they are Zeus and Hermes or Mercury. And Philemon and Baucis are of course, shocked. And the gods then say to them, because you took us in, because you were kind and compassionate, we would like to grant you a wish. What can we do for you? And so Philemon and Baucis could have asked for anything. And the one thing they ask for is, may we be the two who tend to your temple. That's the first thing. But the more important part of that wish is that we do not want to die separately, but we want to die together, so one of us doesn't have to live without the other. So can you see to it that when we go, we go together? So the gods are quite touched by this and moved by this, and they grant these wishes, the wish especially for Philemon and Baucis to tend the temple. All of that is encapsulated really in the Rembrandt. What Rubens is interested in is what happens next. Once the gods find this couple that's very compassionate, now they've gone through this entire town and they're ready to leave. But now, because they've been rebuffed by everybody else in the town, they're going to destroy the town. So in the painting on the left by Rubens, you have to really hunt to find the gods and Philemon and Baucis. They're right here. But what the scene really is about is this storm that is now going to destroy this town and all the people in it who rebuffed the gods. So for Rubens, this is a classic, great Baroque dramatic storm, thunder and lightning, and the whole area is being sort of inundated. So again, here the storm is driven by a mythological story, which is again very common in addition to biblical sources. Now in America, we have a painting like this, two paintings that are part of a series that you probably are familiar with. The Voyage of Life by Thomas Cole in the 19th century, 1842. There are four paintings. I'm just showing you the last two, The Voyage of Life on the left, Manhood, and The Voyage of Life on the right, Old Age, both from 1842. This tells the story of a young boy from his birth to his sort of childhood, his adulthood, and then to old age. This, in essence, is certainly religious. It's spiritual, shall we say, maybe not specifically religious, but it certainly has a spiritual connotation. And that's the reason these four paintings were then translated into prints. And in the United States, every home had the four prints in their home as a way of sort of having a didactic purpose for teaching your children about what you can expect as you grow up and how to deal with the vicissitudes of life, so to speak. But what's important in Cole's images here, beyond just the story, and in the story on the left, you see the adulthood. This man has grown up to adulthood. Now he's facing the rapids. He's lost the tiller of his little boat. The hourglass is broken off. Time is running out. He's heading towards this disaster. On the right, finally, in old age, he is rescued by the guardian angel who had been with him from the time he was born, who now in old age is about to help him sort of ascend up into the heavens. But the interesting thing here beyond that story is the portrayal of the landscape and the sky and the threatening effects of the weather and the wind and the rain, all of which Cole is very, very sensitive to. So here he's kind of grafting on those two interests. Cole wrote one of the most famous essays about American landscape that everybody has to read from 1836. It is called Essay on American Scenery. And what Cole said in that essay was that, quote, the soul of all scenery, that the sky, quote, is the soul of all scenery. In it are the fountains of light and shade and color. So he was emphasizing the importance of a painter to paint sky and the drama of a sky, that's the soul of the landscape painting. And then he went on to speak to the magnificence of American landscape. This is something that greatly influenced Frederick Church, by the way, where Cole says that the American landscape is, quote, for variety and magnificence, American skies are unsurpassed. So he was, in many ways, what Cole was also reacting to was the inferiority complex that Americans had vis-a-vis European painting at this time. And Cole was asserting the importance of American painting. Now, that does take us to the Europeans and some of the Europeans, and one of the most important certainly is on the left, Turner. This is Turner's great painting, Snowstorm, and then subtitled Hannibal and His Army Crossing the Alps from 1812. You have to really hunt again to see the army. And in a comparable way, the painting that we have at the National Gallery, which is by John Martin, great admirer of Turner's, Joshua commanding the sun to stand still upon Gideon from 1816. So these are essentially contemporary paintings. This is now whether, shall we say, in service to history and religion. The Turner painting is history, Hannibal. The Martin painting is still religion, Joshua. So you see, again, how artists think about portraying these events from the Bible or from history. But in both cases, it's really the storms that are the subject. It's not so much the actual portrayal of this specific event. So the snowstorm and the effects of light and all of the atmospheric effects of the Turner are just absolutely magnificent and closely observed. And even in the Martin, it's a similar effect. So you can see these storms kind of becoming more and more, even within a painting that has a mythological or historical or religious subject, the setting, the effects of the storm or the sea or the weather are becoming important, if not more important than the story. That seems to really culminate in these two paintings by Turner. I don't know if you were here many, many years ago. We did a beautiful Turner show, and we had this painting on the left in the exhibition. These paintings are a pair. They're meant to go together, and they speak to a couple of different ideas, but they speak to a very empirical, although they have, in fact, biblical subjects. They're really paintings that are much more about empirical observation. So the painting on the left, which has an incredibly long title, it's called Light and Color, Goethe's Theory, The Morning After the Deluge, Moses Writing the Book of Genesis. That's from 1843. That's the whole title. And then its pendant, the painting that goes with it, is the one on the right by Turner, called Shade and Darkness, The Evening of the Deluge, same year, 1843. So you see what we have here are these explosive scenes of a storm and wind and rain through these kind of almost scientifically induced kind of prismatic bubbles, that circular effect, as if we're looking through a lens. And really, the painting on the left clearly has a biblical connotation. It's about God's covenant with man after the flood, and Turner writes about all this, the presence of the brazen serpent raised by Moses in the wilderness. All of that's in there, although I would defy you to find it all, but it's in there. And the same with on the right, the evening of the deluge. They have those meanings. But in essence, what these paintings were for Turner were an allusion to a very important theory of color that had been written some 30 years earlier, and that was by the German poet and theorist and writer, and he was a jack of all trades, Goethe. Goethe had written a very important text in 1810 called Theory of Colors, in which he attempted to describe and explain how colors behave. He created this kind of color wheel, kind of a circle in his theory, and he divided colors up into plus and minus colors. Plus colors were the hot colors, reds and yellows, and for Goethe, they were associated with ideas of gaiety and warmth, sort of happiness, you might say. The minus colors were blues, the cooler colors, purples, and he thought these were symbolic of restlessness and anxiety, things of that nature. So what actually Turner was doing here in two different paintings, he was trying to deal with these two sides, the hot and the cool side of Goethe's own theory. But in fact, he was probably also taking Goethe to task here, because Goethe's theory stated that color was equally the product of light and dark. And Turner did not believe that. He did not believe that color came from an equal presence of light and dark. So he was probably trying to speak to that particular aspect of Goethe's theory in these two paintings. Of course, these are pretty tough paintings even today, and critics in Turner's time hated them, of course. One critic from the Times, the London Times, writing about Shade and Darkness, called it, quote, a ridiculous daub. And then writing about the painting at the left, he said that it was, quote, a wretched mixture of trumpery conceits. Trumpery conceits. In The Spectator, another magazine, the critic writing about the paintings said that, in fact, he said, I do think they're intelligible as dealing with Goethe's theories, but then he said, but further, we cannot follow the painter. So after that, I have no idea what Turner's trying to do here. But these paintings are whetting the scientific eye of Turner with this there is still certainly a connotation or a reference to the symbolic aspects of the storm. And in both of these cases, it still is, in fact, a biblical storm. Now, if you look at Romantic painting, if you look at Turner and Delacroix and Cole, and you look at the similar ideas about how one is approaching nature, atmosphere, weather effects, especially storms, you see a similar kind of track, a similar kind of development in literature. And we can, again, for the Romantics, especially going back to Dante or to Shakespeare or to Milton, it's the same idea of how these storms play a prominent role. So, in the 19th century, we come to that great writer, Snoopy, actually in the 20th century, but one of the most famous novels of the 19th century that today is even sort of parodied, obviously, as Snoopy's doing here, is by Edward Bulwer Lytton, and the novel is called Paul Clifford. You see the first page here on the left, it's from 1830. Lytton was a novelist, a historian. He was a close friend with Charles Dickens. In fact, he critiqued a lot of Dickens' writings. And of course, if you want another novel in the 19th century that is filled with storms and mud and all of the things, certainly Dickens' Bleak House is a good example. But Bulwer Lytton writes a novel called Paul Clifford, the story of a man who, this takes place during the period of the French Revolution. And Clifford is a man who leads a double life. He's a criminal, but he also presents himself as a kind of upscale, aristocratic gentleman. And the book was very successful upon its release. And it came to be known for its very first sentence, which Snoopy here is writing in part. And the very first sentence of the book, which you can read on the left, is as follows. It was a dark and stormy night. The rain fell in torrents, except at occasional intervals, when it was checked by a violent gust of wind which swept up the streets. For it is London that our scene lies, rattling along the housetops and fiercely agitating the scanty flame of the lamps that struggle against the darkness. That's quite a sentence. And it's, of course, this example of an overly ornate and flowery and overly descriptive prose that we come to call today purple prose. And Bulwer Lytton is the sort of master of purple prose. But the point is, in a whole host of 19th century novels, not just Bulwer Lytton, but the Bronte sisters and others, you have this constant reference to these cyclonic storms, but they're almost always tied to a emotional relationship, to a relationship that is in tension or that's threatened, and where you probably see it best is in Wuthering Heights. So here I'm showing you the poster from the American film, one of the great films from the 1930s, 1939, directed by William Wyler, that had Sir Laurence Olivier as Heathcliff, Merle Oberon was Catherine, David Niven was in the movie. The cinematography was Greg Tolan, who was the cinematographer of Citizen Kane with Orson Welles, a great cinematographer. And I'm showing you one of the stills from the film on the right, which is, of course, a storm scene. So Emily Bronte's novel comes out in 1847, and it, again, was tremendously successful. It's filled with these atmospheric, melodramatic ghosts and storms and spooky old houses and scoundrels and all of these romantic but tortured relationships. And the weather in the book is a character. And whenever a relationship is about to go south, shall we say, the weather sort of relates to that. In fact, the word itself that Bronte uses, wuthering, Bronte said, was, quote, descriptive of the atmospheric tumult on the moors. So she even sees that word as symbolic of this. There's one literary historian who's written about this book and about this atmospheric tumult, and she calls Wuthering Heights, quote, the single greatest instance of psychometeorology in Western literature. So you can almost tell what's happening. As soon as Heathcliff does something and breaks with Catherine, then the house starts to crack apart and gets struck by lightning and things like that. So one of the passages that's in Wuthering Heights that typifies this is this one. About midnight, while we sat up, the storm came rattling over the heights in full fury. There was a violent wind as well as thunder, and either one of the others split a tree off at the corner of the building. A huge bough fell across the roof and knocked down a portion of the east chimney stack, sending a clatter of stones and soot into the kitchen fire. This is almost as purple as Bulwer Lytton. She uses the same word, rattling. This is a word Victorians loved about the wind, that it was always rattling. So you see it in both passages. Later, this, again, I'm just sort of showing this to you in a few examples, this tracing of weather. And here in the case of romantic literature, it's still tied to these sort of psychological states. Even into the 20th century, the example I always like to talk about is one of the great short stories by James Joyce, and that's The Dead, which is in his collection titled Dubliners, from 1914. Here again, I'm showing you the film, the poster on the left for the 1987 film that was made by John Huston, his last film before he died. And this was a film this is a story he always wanted to tell. Huston's roots went way back to Ireland. He loved Joyce. His daughter, Angelica, stars in this movie. His son helped write the script and adapt the story. So it was a very important film for John Huston. I'm showing you a couple of shots on the right. The cinematographer here was Fred Murphy. It's in the Dead, it's not so much violent storms, it's the snow and a snowstorm that is the more relevant kind of dramatic, symbolic and dramatic detail. The image of snow in Dubliners, The Dead, it's certainly a notation of weather, without a doubt, but it also has very subtle metaphysical relationships and relates to other issues. So the most famous passage to illustrate this is the last phrase or the last passage basically in the book, in the story. It's one of the most beautiful paragraphs in Western literature. There are certain things I go back and read all the time just because they're so beautiful. The last couple of paragraphs in The Great Gatsby are like that. It's just something you go back and read. It doesn't matter how many times you read it. And the same thing is true with this passage in Joyce in The Dead. It reads, "It had begun to snow again. He watched sleepily the flakes, silver and dark, falling obliquely against the lamplight. Yes, the newspapers were right. Snow was general all over Ireland. It was falling on every part of the dark central plain, on the treeless hills, falling softly upon the bog of Allen, and farther westward, softly falling into the dark, mutinous Shannon waves. It was falling, too, upon every part of the lonely churchyard on the hill where Michael Fury lay buried. It lay thickly drifted on the crooked crosses and headstones, on the spears of the little gate, on the barren thorns. His soul swooned slowly as he heard the snow falling faintly through the universe and faintly falling like the descent of their last end upon all the living and the dead." That calls for a dramatic pause. That's a beautiful passage. Okay, so I've been trying to show you this use of weather, storms, whatever, sort of symbolically tied to history, religion, mythology, and then even carry through in romantic literature to have a more almost psychological impact. But where do we really start the story of an approach to weather or an approach to storms and things of this nature that really is very specifically scientific and empirical? Whenever you ask that question in Western art, if you don't know the answer, just always guess Leonardo da Vinci. He's probably the guy who's responsible. That's what I tell my students, just guess Leonardo. So here is our Ginevra da Benci, obviously, from 1474-78, and I'm really more interested not in the figure but in the landscape to the right that you see in that detail, which could almost stand as a separate painting. In the visual arts, with Leonardo is where we really begin to see this kind of empirical, scientific interest, at least, in nature. In other words, it's less weather seen as iconography and more weather seen as a fact, just as an empirical fact. We see it in his paintings, in these wonderful atmospheric backgrounds that show not just linear perspective, but atmospheric perspective. This beautiful diaphanous movement of atmosphere, evaporation, and water as we go off into the distance. I mean, the painting you can feel almost the humidity in the evaporation of water in these parts of the painting. What is pivotal for Leonardo, and this is what separates him from his colleagues Michelangelo and Raphael, what's pivotal for Leonardo is the eye. He always talks about the primacy of the eye. Each of these other artists, Raphael, Michelangelo, they had a different touchstone in their career. For Michelangelo, it's the male nude figure. For Raphael, it's classical art. But for Leonardo, it was the primacy of the eye. And so he is constantly telling us, just look. Just look. Take time and look. So Here is a drawing, a red chalk drawing on the left by Leonardo, a storm over a valley from 1506 to 1510. It's in the Royal Collection at Windsor. That's a red chalk, and on the right is a black chalk from the same collection, a deluge from 1517. It's in these depictions of storms coming up over these alpine valleys and storms at sea and deluges, etc., where you see Leonardo beginning to really approach nature in this very meteorologically empirical kind of fashion. He went out into the landscape. He certainly did sketches that he came back and worked on in his studio. He made detailed descriptions of weather in his notebooks, even on some of the drawings. We know he began to collect and categorize, catalog fossils that he found. Leonardo had already come to the conclusion that the Earth was much older than indicated certainly by the Bible. He loved especially freak storms, when he would be out and all of a sudden there would just be a freak thunderstorm. One minute it was sunny and the next minute all of a sudden a storm would break, especially in these valleys where the weather effects were they were harder to predict. So he's looking at things with the eye of a scientist in many ways when he's out in nature, and he's fascinated by these optical properties of wind and rain and atmosphere, etc. Here are two drawings that are part of, we think they're probably part of a series of 10 because they're all the same size and they're all basically the same medium. There's a deluge on the left from 1517 to 18, and on the right, same title, same date, deluge 1517. These are part of the collection, the Royal Collection at Windsor. There are 10 of these, and they're uniform in size, and they're, for the most part, they're not all in the same technique, but they show pretty much a prevalence for black chalk, some pen and ink, depending on what we're talking about. They're intended clearly as finished works. These are not studies. These were intended by Leonardo to be finished works, and there's a series of 10 that he produced. They were meant for his own satisfaction. They never left his studio. What's interesting is what scientists, specifically there's one art historian who happens to also be a geologist. She brings together these two fields. Her name is Ann Pizzo-Russo. She's both a Renaissance art historian and also a geologist. And she actually claims, looking at these drawings, that Leonardo was the first to really see the swirling patterns of water and air that are at the heart of a hurricane, these rotational winds that are part of a hurricane. She makes the case in her book. She published it's a wonderful book with a horrible title. The title of the book is Tweeting Da Vinci. It came out in 2014. And she says that he's identifying these swirling patterns of a hurricane 500 years before technology has shown these patterns to us through satellite photographs. She writes at one point, quote, "Leonardo was the first to identify hurricanes. What he depicted would be discovered by meteorologists in the 1970s and called vortex flow patterns, rotating masses of air or water spinning about an imaginary axis. These patterns are similar to hurricane configurations so familiar to us today," unquote. So that's one of her quotes. She goes through these drawings and talks about them at great length. Here is a Leonardo drawing, one of those series on the left, Deluge 1517, again black chalk, and that is a satellite image of a hurricane on the right that we have today. And what you sense in these deluge, and clearly that's not to say that the theme of the deluge didn't still have for Leonardo some deeper resonance symbolically, maybe not even so much biblically, but maybe more personally about a number of things, his old age and other things that were beginning to occupy his thinking. But in any case, he's fascinated by these deluges that really just pulverize everything. They sweep across the surface. There are these plumes of water and lightning issuing from these clouds. So Leonardo is, I think, the place to start, certainly. And then we just see a kind of back and forth artists who move more towards that scientific strain, artists who are still somewhat thinking more symbolically. And this takes us through all of the 17th century storms at sea, which have different connotations, especially if we're looking at the Low Countries, if we're looking at Holland. These are two paintings by Backhausen, Ludolf Backhausen. We have a beautiful Backhausen. It's the one on the left that's in our collection, Ships in Distress off a Rocky Coast from 1667. And on the right is a Backhausen, Christ in the Storm on the Sea of Galilee, so he's going back to that source from 1695. Painting on the right is at Indianapolis, in the Indianapolis Museum of Art. Certainly all these Dutch storms at sea, all these ships in distress, often with their cargoes now sort of scattered on the waves as they're trying to negotiate their way to the safety of land, probably serve in a traditional Dutch way, much like their still lifes, believe it or not, as a kind of reminders of the fact that earthly existence is fleeting. We're a wealthy country. We bring our products all over the world. But that wealth, that prestige, that materialism is still something that can be destroyed. It can end very quickly. In France, Vernet, Claude Joseph Vernet, and the painting on the right is, again, one of the beautiful paintings we have. On the right is the Shipwreck from 1772 in our collection. On the left is a storm from 1765. That's at the Hermitage in St. Petersburg. A similar kind of feeling here to the Dutch tradition of Backhausen. Here, in the 18th century, these are works that are in the exhibition. I will be showing you a number of works that are in the exhibition as we go along, and the work on the right specifically is in the exhibition. This is the work of Fragonard, the French Rococo painter in the 18th century. The Watering Place on the left from 1763 to 65, and Mountain Landscape at Sunset on the right from 1765. We know certainly that Fragonard was looking at Dutch painting, specifically Ruysdael, van Ruysdael, his seascapes and landscapes. But in the 18th century, in the Rococo in France, there's a different aesthetic, and certainly Fragonard is responding to his own time, to his own 18th century Rococo sensibility, because now you begin to see, especially in that sketch on the right, a kind of more subtle, lighter, it's a less threatening, it has a slightly more pastoral in both cases. There certainly are interesting cloud formations and backlighting and all of that. But clearly he's creating a scene that's a little simply more Rococo, to put it bluntly. We think that the Watering Place on the left, the painting that's in a private collection, by the way, meant to be a pair with another painting called Stormy Weather. So he was probably also speaking maybe to this idea of calm and storm, which is very common. We come to Gainsborough on the left, Thomas Gainsborough. This is a painting in our collection, Seashore with Fishermen, from 1781 to 82. And then a work on the right by a German who is not that well known today and should be better known. And that's the one thing about this exhibition. There are a number of artists, most of whom I'm sure you've never heard of, but they should be better known, and they were very important. So this is a work on the right. It's a gouache, drawing on vellum, or painting on vellum, by Johann Dietz. Dietz is a German from the 18th century. The Gainsborough is interesting because this idea of going out into the open air, I want to paint a landscape. So, it might be a good idea if I go outside and look at a landscape. That didn't strike artists immediately. And Gainsborough is, of course, the best example of this, because we know that Thomas Gainsborough used to collect. He'd go out and he'd get a clump of dirt, and he'd get a rock, and he'd get a piece of coal, and he'd get some moss, and he'd get some broccoli. He'd go to the market and buy some broccoli. And then he'd come back to his studio, and he'd set all these things up on his table. And that would be the source of the landscape. So very often when you're looking at some formation, it's probably a piece of coal. He may change the color, etc. But the thing I like the best is that when you look at a Gainsborough, his trees, often you say to yourself, geez, that looks like broccoli. And then you're right, because it probably was broccoli. He probably was looking at a little clump of broccoli that he bought at the market. Now that's different than this. And now we get into, again, especially some of the artists in the exhibition. These are two paintings by a German, Johann Dillis, D-I-L-L-I-S. Cloud Study, 1810 to 1820 on the left. It's a white chalk drawing on blue paper. And then view of the Ankel Alps on the right from 1817, which is actually black chalk heightened with white chalk. These works on blue paper are particularly attractive, at least to my eye. Dillis is a very important, distinguished German artist of this period, right around 1800. He was a professor. He was from Munich. He was a professor of landscape painting at the Munich Academy. He advocated that his students go outside, look at in the open air, look at cloud studies. We have today over 150 cloud studies by Dillis. That's probably not all that he did, but those are the ones that are extant. He did go out in the open air and execute oil studies, watercolors. Watercolor especially became something he became attracted to. What's interesting is that he did paint in the open air, but he was also very busy. He was an administrator, a professor, he had a teacher, he had a lot of things going on. So often he did cloud studies in his office, looking out his window. He would just watch the clouds go by when he was at his desk in his office, and then he would do a quick sketch. He was influenced by a source, a book that I'm now going to introduce, and we're going to look more at these scientific treatises in a second. But the book that had a huge impact on many of these painters is a scientific treatise that they were reading, and it was by a man named Luke Howard. And the book is called Essay on the Modification of Clouds. Essay on the Modification of Clouds. I'm going to come back to this in a second, but this is the book. It's an early study in meteorology, and in this book, it's Howard who sets out the names of the clouds that we know today. So the idea of cirrus and stratus and cumulus. In fact, he gives the clouds their Latin names. Those are Latin names, of course, that we then still use today. So what we see as these artists go out into the open air and begin to really look at the sky, then now they want more information about actually how does a cloud work, how does it form, what is its unique nature. At the same time, we still have, though, things like this. These are two paintings we have at the gallery. They hang next to each other. I've lectured on both of these in relationship to the idea of the sublime. Caspar David Friedrich's Northern Landscape on the left, Spring from 1825. Friedrich, of course, is German. And the Norwegian painter Johan Christian Dahl on the right. The view from Vakkero near Christiania. Christiania was the name of Oslo at this time, from 1827. Friedrich is certainly the most important landscape painter working in the northern continent of Europe during the first half of the 19th century, up until 1850 or so. He is from Dresden, he settles in Dresden. He travels to Berlin and other places, but ultimately settles in Dresden. And certainly Friedrich's attitude towards nature is certainly romantic. I mean, he sees nature, he's very much moved by romantic poetry, romantic literature, romantic philosophy. But what he does stress more and more is this kind of immensity of nature and how nature dwarfs us, so that when you look at a painting like this, there are two little people right there, but they're in this gigantic, immense spring landscape that is a northern landscape that doesn't look much like spring, but you can see little tufts of things growing out that speak to the coming of spring. So certainly Friedrich's paintings are still speaking to the spirit, transience of life, to the idea of death and rebirth. His earlier landscape paintings are pretty direct, because he might even have a little shrine, a little crucifix somewhere, something. I mean, he's pretty direct early on, but he becomes less and less literal as he goes along through his career. But he once said, quote, that the artist, quote, should paint not only what he sees before him, but also what he sees within him, so that your emotional response to a landscape should be somewhat incorporated. Dahl, the painter on the right, goes hand in hand with Friedrich. They were friends. Dahl came from Bergen, but then he moved to Copenhagen. And then he meets Friedrich in Dresden, and then they share a house together. They're housemates. So they're working side by side. And Dahl's work owes a lot to the spirit of Friedrich, these backlit scenes where you're looking over the shoulder of figures. So we have these empathetic views off into this moody kind of landscape, but also still beginning to capture the qualities of these atmospheric effects. Paintings like the painting on the left, so simplified and so stratified, sky, land, the distant mountains, and then the foreground, just these horizontal registers. In the 1970s, I think it was 79, Robert Rosenblum wrote a great book about painting in the Northern Romantic tradition. And he talks about Friedrich as almost a precursor ultimately to somebody like Mark Rothko, that the sense of what you see in Friedrich, Rothko just pushes farther towards pure abstraction. These are works in the exhibition. I just showed you the painting by Dahl. That's not in the exhibition, that's in our permanent collection, but these two works are in the show by Johann Christian Dahl. Thunderclouds on the left from 1831. It's at the National Gallery in Oslo. And the Neapolitan coast with Vesuvius on the right, with Vesuvius in eruption on the right from 1820. This is from the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge. This exhibition, when it closes here, will go to Paris, and then it'll close at the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, where a lot of the works come from. So here, now we're back to this really closer, more empirical observation of cloud studies. Notice, though, that Dahl gives us land. So he puts us on land, which is a different feeling than just a pure sky view, where you're disoriented a bit by the view. Remember, I mentioned that most of these artists, so here's Dahl, who's Norwegian, but he's coming all the way south to Italy. So you had, one of the things that you need to pay attention to in this exhibition is all of the different nationalities of the artists: Swedish, Norwegian, German, French, American, and they're all coming towards Rome. They're fascinated by the Roman Campagna, they're going out, and then they're moving even further south. So from Rome, they go down towards Naples, they paint Vesuvius, they go into Calabria, they paint the ruins at Paestum, places like that. Then they even cross over into Sicily. Another volcano in Sicily is Mount Etna. This whole subject of the volcano, especially at this point in time, especially in the Victorian era, coming back to Bulwer-Lytton, the book you may know by him, maybe his most famous book, is not Paul Clifford, it's The Last Days of Pompeii from 1843. We did a big Pompeii show here several years ago, and we had the last room almost dedicated to Bulwer-Lytton and paintings that came off of that novel. For the Victorian, the volcano is also interesting in in another way. There's a very rich iconographic tradition of portraying volcanoes in Victorian painting in 19th century, late 19th century painting, and especially in England in the Victorian era. The volcano was seen as symbolic of our own. Again, it was kind of like, I can't remember the phrase that writer used about Bronte, but psychometeorology. In other words, for example, it wasn't really appropriate for a man and a woman to look at a painting of a volcano erupting together because it had implications. I don't think I need to lay this out for you anymore, but it had other aspects to it. And especially in sort of tight, buttoned-up Victorian society where everybody is repressing everything, the volcano was seen as something that could be potentially rather dangerous. So that's why we often see lots of volcanoes by artists. Another artist in the exhibition who's quite talented is another German. This is Carl Gustav Karus. This is Peaks in the Clouds on the left, which is in a private collection in Switzerland. A number of the works in this show come from private collections. And a Karus work on the right, Morning Fog from 1825. The one on the left is oil on paper. The one on the right is a watercolor on paper. That's from the Alte National Gallery in Berlin. Carus is a German, he's one of these Renaissance men. He's a physiologist, he's a painter, he's a doctor, he's a naturalist, he's a scientist, he was a psychologist. I mean, he wore many hats. And he actually studied briefly under Caspar David Friedrich, so he actually studied under Friedrich early in his career. He travels pretty widely and gives us, again, these beautiful views, especially of clouds over peaks, mountain peaks. This becomes another subcategory almost. It's one thing to show clouds. It's one thing to show clouds over a landscape. That's just a level landscape. But clouds over these great peaks, especially in the Alps, where they create, again, their own weather system when it's in the mountains and things like that. This becomes very attractive. This is something that John Ruskin was particularly attracted to. We'll talk more about Ruskin as we get along. Certainly paintings of dawn and dusk, those two times of day are particularly attractive to all of these artists. Here on the left, another Danish artist. This is Johan Thomas Lundby, Clouds Heavy with Rain. Clouds Heavy with Rain. It's above a particular landscape that I literally cannot pronounce. It's a Danish word that has about 12 consonants in it. So just remember, Clouds Heavy with Rain from 1838. This comes from the Morgan Library on the left. And then he's Danish, but the guy on the right is Norwegian. That's Thomas Fearnley. Sunset, Sorrento, 1834. I can pronounce Sorrento. So you see, again, Sorrento going south to the Amalfi Coast on the right. Fearnley is very interesting, the painter who painted the sunset on the right. He's a disciple and a student of Johann Christian Dahl. And he's particularly attentive to the role of light in his studies. You see these artists, they start to sort of, you can see their interest going one place or another. Some are more interested in the cloud formation, some are more interested in light, some are interested in dusk, some are interested in dawn. You can start to sort of pick out their predilections. He writes on this drawing, literally the place and time. It's written Sorrento, May 22nd, 1834. Dahl, who was his teacher, Johann Christian Dahl, thought that Fearnley's open-air sketches were the best things that he created. He even wrote at one point describing them as, quote, better than his finished paintings, for in them he gave of his true self as he was and as he felt when face to face with nature. This idea of face to face with nature is actually quite significant, because when you paint in the open air, not in your studio, and when you're directly confronting nature, that is a relationship. And for many artists, that was a new relationship, to literally go outside and look and have a direct kind of reaction response, a direct visual challenge to you. So that's we sort of take it for granted today. We don't think much about it, but it actually is a particularly important idea in itself. The French painter Valenciennes, Pierre-Henri de Valenciennes, is important. These are two works by Valenciennes. Study of Clouds over the Roman Campagna on the left, 1782 to 85. This is actually in our permanent collection. It's in the show, but we own it. It's an oil on paper and then transferred to cardboard. And on the right, A View of Rome, 1782 to 85. Valenciennes is important because he writes a treatise, sort of like a manual, sort of a guide, a treatise, in which he gives instructions to artists about how to work in the open air. And this was a pretty well-read book. He tells them to always start with the sky. When you go outside, the first thing you want to start, you don't want to start with the land, or you want to start with the sky. That's going to determine your palette, and that's probably going to determine your overall composition as well. And then he stresses something that also John Ruskin will talk about later, and that is you should work quickly. You should come, sit, look, start to work, and you should not do anything. It shouldn't take anything. Nothing should take longer than 2 hours. You should really, and once you kind of lose the memory, you're losing the image in your head, you should stop because the effects are changing. So this is pretty good advice, and many artists sort of work in that particular fashion. Normally, if I'm talking about Impressionism, you have to talk about certain things, and so I've brought back some things that are relevant to this discussion, even though we're long before the French Impressionists. And that is, if you're going to start painting in the open air, it sets in motion a series of just simple practical elements that you have to deal with. I have to take my paints outside, I have to sit on something, I have to have some kind of support for my work, etc. So in a very encapsulated way here, one of the reasons you could work outside is because ultimately paints will be produced in metal tubes. But before that, and relevant in fact to some of the painters we're talking about, for example, Constable, the earliest tradition of packaging your paints so that you could take them outside were in pig bladders. So to the far left, you see these little bladders. Usually they were a pig bladder, and that you would put your paint in there, and then you'd have a little thumbtack or a little tack that would close the top of it. When you're outside, though, as soon as you open up that bladder and start painting, it's going to get dry pretty quickly. The next development was towards carrying paint in what we would call today a sort of syringe tube. It acted like a syringe. You could push the paint out. But those weren't particularly airtight either. And then as you just move across on this chart to the right, of course, the metal paint tube is where things then become really efficient and effective and easy to work with. But it's even more than the paint tube. It was the screw cap that's important, that you could close the tube with a screw cap that would keep it very airtight. So here we have kind of a brief overview from the bladder to the metal tube with a screw cap. Okay, you still had to have some kind of support. Here's a much later painting by John Singer Sargent that shows Monet painting by the edge of a wood in 1885. And what he is using here to support his picture. Now, the guys that we're talking about for this exhibition they're painting very small, things that are about the size of a sheet of notebook paper. So they didn't really need an easel. But in terms of painting on a larger scale, the invention of the French box easel, an easel that could be broken down, it had telescoping legs, and when it was all closed down, you could carry it like a briefcase. So now you had your paint in tubes, you had your portable easel, and then ultimately, certainly for the Impressionists and for Barbizon painters, you still had to get somewhere. And one of the great revolutions is a very practical one. Sometimes the history of art moves ahead simply because of science and technological things, the development of the railway. So here you see the railway system on the left in Paris, in and around France, in around 1860. And then I'm just showing you on the right some of those very famous locations you're all familiar with where the Impressionists went out to paint. So with the railway, that meant you could get up in the morning in Paris, you could have your little box easel, your paints and tubes, and your knapsack, pack a lunch, get on the train in the morning, go out somewhere to paint out in the outskirts, in the suburbs, paint all day, and then get back on the train and be back in Paris for dinner. So that changed a lot of things. Now, I made reference to these scientific treatises, and there are some that are more important than others. I've already alluded to the one by Luke Howard, which you see here on the upper left. I just want to call these to your attention. We're not necessarily going to go through them in depth, but one of the most important is the book that I mentioned already called Essay on the Modification of Clouds, written by a British pharmacist, Luke Howard, and that was published in 1803, and you see that one up there on the upper left. As I mentioned to you, it's Howard who sets out the classification system of clouds that we use today. He gives them their Latin names that we still use: cirrus, stratus, cumulus, nimbus. Those are words, by the way, in English that you would translate as curl, layer, mass, rain. That's how those would translate. My favorite, slightly different, it's not so much about the clouds, it's about the winds, is this one here. And that's the famous Beaufort scale, created in 1805 by Francis Beaufort, who was an admiral in the Navy, but he was an Irish hydrographer as well. And what he was concerned with, especially from the point of view of being in the Navy, was trying to standardize descriptions of wind. You might tell me it's breezy out, and then I would go out and I would be knocked over, and I would say, gee, that's not a breeze, that's a gale. And there was no standard way of referring to wind speed. So one person's breeze was another person's wind, was another person's gale. And so what he attempted to do was to standardize wind speed. So we would all use the same vocabulary. And then what that wind speed would do on land and what that wind speed would do if you were at sea. And he comes up with a chart that I'll talk about in a second, but let's go on for the moment. In 1815, up here, we have the book by Thomas Foster. This is a book that greatly influenced Constable. Its researches about atmospheric phenomena. And this was, in essence, another kind of systematic classification of clouds for the most part. And then a person who's of great significance, it's hard to kind of just brush by this guy because he casts a huge shadow, is John Ruskin. The lower right, I'm showing you the work that is among his most important, Modern Painters, which ran to 5 volumes and was published between 1843 and 1860. But when Ruskin was even a young man, for example, he gave his first lecture at the age of 18 on the present state of meteorological science, and that was in 1839. Modern Painters comes out in 1884. Later in his life, he comes back and gives a series of lectures at the London Institute that are titled The Storm Cloud of the 19th Century. So these are in 1884. Now that term storm cloud is interesting because what Ruskin talks about in those lectures when he uses the term storm cloud, it's actually not a cloud that's a stormy cloud. He's talking about pollution. He's now talking about the storm cloud that is beginning to engulf England and the continent because of the burning of coal, and that this is a storm cloud. And you'll see Turner and others, I'll show you an example a little later, where you'll see a painting or drawing that'll have like a church steeple on one side and it'll have smokestacks on the other side, belching out smoke. So Ruskin is already ahead of the curve in terms of climate science, the effects of pollution. So he refers in that lecture to this idea of the storm cloud, which he calls, and he was specifically talking about the city of Manchester, this great industrial city. He called it Manchester Devil's Darkness. And very often when you see him use this word devil, he's talking about pollution in his writings. So he's very important, and we'll come back to Ruskin. Here's Beaufort. This is a portrait of Beaufort on the left by Stephen Pearce, Rear Admiral Sir Francis Beaufort on the left from 1855 to 56. And that is the Beaufort scale on the right. You can find this anywhere, in which he then laid out these sort of categories of wind speeds. As I said, somebody's stiff breeze might be another person's soft breeze, and he tries to sort of standardize all this. Now, I have to just tell a personal story here. About 8 or 9 years ago, I went to the Shakespeare Theater to see a performance by Sir Ian McKellen. And it was when he was doing this one-person show. He would just go around and talk about his life and his career and all of that. It was absolutely hypnotic and mesmerizing. And at one point, what he did, and this is apparently something he had done in his life earlier as an actor, he read, or shall we say he performed, the Beaufort scale as if it was a narrative. So he took the actual chart, which I have here right in front of me, and you can see there, and there's a number 0 through 12, and then there's the name of the wind, calm, light air, light breeze, gentle breeze, and then the speeds, and then the effects observed far from land, the effects observed on the land, etc. And he just read it, but he read it like a dramatic text. So he would start and he would say, I'm not Sir Ian McKellen, but you'll get the idea. He would say, calm, calm, smoke rises vertically, seas like a mirror, light air, ripples with appearances of scales, no foam crests, direction of wind shown by smoke drift. And then he just went down the chart until he would get to strong gale, Slight structural damage occurs, chimney pots and slate removed, high seas, sea begins to roll. And then he'd go down, and finally he gets to 12, and he would shout, hurricane, air filled with foam, and he would just go on and on and on. I tell this to you because, first of all, the performance was magnificent, but you can actually find this on YouTube. It's been recorded probably 100 times. It's so famous. So if you want to hear his performance, I'm not sure when it was done, just go to YouTube and type in Sir Ian McKellen Beaufort Scale, and you'll get that evening that I had at the Shakespeare Theater. Now, the science of clouds, so here is our modern cloud. These are our modern clouds, the way meteorologists think of them. There are high clouds, which are cirrus, cirrostratus, cirrocumulus, and each of these is indicative of a particular potential weather pattern. So meteorologists will, for a cirrus, normally it's a change might be on its way in the weather. If it's a cirrostratus, it could be rain or snow will arrive within 24 hours. If it's cirrocumulus, it's going to be fair but possibly cold. However, if you live in a tropical region, this could mean that a hurricane might be approaching. Those are high-level clouds. Mid-level, the altocumulus, the altostratus, the nimbostratus. So fair, altocumulus is associated with fair weather. Altostratus, be prepared for continuous rain or snow. Nimbostratus, gloomy with continuous rain or snow. And then low-lying clouds, and these are especially the clouds that most of these artists were kind of riveted on. Cumulus, the prediction normally is fair weather. Stratus, fair but gloomy. Cumulonimbus, look out for rain, could be hail. And the bottom one, stratocumulus, fair weather for now, but a storm might be on its way. So this is the way we think of clouds today. That terminology goes back to Luke Howard, goes back to the 19th century. And the artist, though, who is at the core, the pivotal artist in this whole discussion, I think, of cloud studies, is the English artist Constable. John Constable sits right at the nexus of this whole discussion. This is our great painting, Wivenhoe Park, Essex, on the left from 1816. And then a cloud study that we own at the gallery that's in the exhibition, Cloud Study Stormy Sunset, 1821 to 22. So these are both works in our permanent collection. Constable produced over 100, that we know of, over 100 sketches of the sky in the open air and en plein air. And he called this exercise, he gave a term to it, he had a term for it, skying. He would tell people, I'm going out skying. And that meant he was going to go out and sit down somewhere outside and look up at the clouds and do these pure cloud studies in oil, most often omitting the horizon entirely. He's looking just right up into the air without any kind of orientation of landscape. Sometimes we'll see a few here and there. But then he makes this series of notations on most of these drawings, usually on the back sides of the drawings. He will note the season, the time of day, the wind direction, the weather conditions, sometimes the temperature, even the barometric pressure in some cases. He brought all this equipment out with him as well. So he really is interested in the emerging science of meteorology. He's really into that. When he reads Luke Howard, he finds that very, very interesting. These are, again, works not conceived for the public. They're not meant to be exhibited. They're works for his own purposes. What he is accumulating with these cloud studies is a kind of what I call a Rolodex of cloud studies that he can have in his studio, and he has all these notations on the back. So when he actually is painting a painting in his studio and he wants a particular effect of sky or something, or cloud, he can flip through these and he can look at the back and remember, oh yes, this was a good humid day and the clouds looked like this, etc. So he had a kind of built-in reference. Here's the great painting, The Hay Wain from 1821 on the left. And then Sky Study with a Shaft of Sunlight on the right from 1822. This is, I think, in the exhibition. It's from the Fitzwilliam in Cambridge. His painting of clouds is based on the same locations he painted almost everything in Suffolk near Flatford on the Stour River. The Hay Wain, of course, is a remarkably important painting because of its when it was exhibited in France at the 1824 Paris Salon. Géricault and Delacroix saw this picture, and they really had their first encounter with the incredible effects of atmosphere in terms of the clouds that touched both Géricault and Delacroix, and also the use of the color green. Delacroix was amazed at the number of shades of green in this picture. He just going on and on about, there are like 50 shades of green in this picture. So all of that brought Constable to the attention of French painters, the French Romantics. This is a beautiful study on the right with the shaft of sunlight. These studies by Constable are breathtakingly beautiful for the most part. Here's Rainstorm Over the Sea from 1824 to 28 on the left from the Royal Academy in London. And Study of a Cloudy Sky on the right from 1825. Here he gives us, in both cases here, he's giving us land. That's really the exception to the rule. Study of a Cloudy Sky on the right. The painting on the right comes from the Yale Center for British Art. Of course, that's the collection that was essentially created by Paul Mellon, who was a great lover of British art. Paul Mellon gave us so many things, but then what he didn't give to us, especially in terms of British art, which he had a great love for, he gave to Yale to set up this entire museum that is now the Center for British Art. Constable read Luke Howard, but he also read the Foster book, Researches About Atmospheric Phenomena from 1815. And we have his copy of that in which he makes notation. He annotates the whole book. So as he's going through it in the margins, he's making annotations about everything that Foster is saying about the way clouds behave in different conditions. Here's the kind of notation he might often make. So on the left is a cloud study, Sunset, 1821. This is from the Yale Center in New Haven. It's an oil on paper, then it's transferred to a piece of millboard. And the back side of it is what you see on the right, where he's made notations. I'll read some of those for you because it's hard for you to see them. He jots on the back of that drawing, quote, very lovely evening, looking eastward, cliffs and light off a dark gray sky, effect and background very white and golden light. Those are notations that he makes on that drawing. In that same year, 1821, he wrote a letter to a friend about this whole idea of skying, and he says to his friend, quote, I have done a great deal of skying. That landscape painter who does not make his sky a very material part of his composition neglects to avail himself of one of his greatest aids. It will be difficult to name a class of landscape in which the sky is not the keynote, the standard of scale, and the chief organ of sentiment. So he's telling us right off the importance of the sky. Valenciennes would have agreed with all of that French artist I mentioned. Here's Cloud Study from 1821 on the left. And again, where he gives you a little bit of tree on the right, Cloud Study, Hampstead, tree at right, 11 September 1821, that's the title. That's at the Royal Academy in London on the right. The one on the left is at Yale. Constable kept notations, aphorisms, kept his thoughts, and he collected them in what we call today the discourses, somewhat like with Sir Joshua Reynolds. And in his discourses, Constable wrote, quote, nature is never seen in this climate, at least to greater perfection than at about 9 o'clock in the mornings of July and August, when the sun has gained sufficient strength to give splendor to the landscape, still gemmed with the morning dew, without its oppressive heat, and it is still more delightful if vegetation has been refreshed with a shower during the night. So he's saying this is the best time to go out looking this month, this time, etc. This painting on the right sort of almost beautifully typifies this particular sentiment. And that painting does, on the right, is inscribed on the back with the following notations. It says, Hampstead, 11 September 1821, 10 to 11, morning, under the sun, clouds silvery gray on warm ground, sultry, light wind to the southwest, fine all day, but rain in the night following. And I'll show you what that looks like, that inscription. There it is. So that's in his own hand on the back of that drawing. Sometimes his drawings do incorporate land, sometimes they incorporate sea, and one of the greatest and richest and densest and most experimental is this one. This is from Yale, Stormy Sea, Brighton, 1828. We think of Gustave Courbet as the great master of the palette knife in these thickly encrusted seascapes that we have a couple of examples that I'll show you later. But certainly Constable could have these richly encrusted, very active surfaces as well. By the way, I mean, you're looking at this thing gigantic, so you have to think of it, this is about the size of a sheet of notebook paper. Here is a study on the left, Salisbury Cathedral from the Meadows from 1829, and that is a study for the painting on the right, same title, Salisbury Cathedral from the Meadows, exhibited in 1831. These are both at the Tate in London. Now, this study on the left can fool you. I just mentioned most of these are notebook size, but this one is not. This study is 2 feet by 1.5 feet, so that's a big one on the left. And it is a study for the painting on the right. A lot's been written here about the changes from the study to the finished painting, most notably the darkening and threatening sky, or at least the storm again passing, the rainbow coming out, even though it would be almost impossible for a rainbow to appear at this particular moment in the sky. So he's taking liberties here. He's clearly taking liberties here. He's not being that empirical. And in fact, once you know this landscape and this setting and where this rainbow is falling, it's falling on the house of the Anglican minister who had gotten him through a kind of spiritual crisis at this time. So it's actually, again, has a kind of deeper symbolic relationship to his life here than most of these had. This painting on the right, he never found a buyer for. He kept it in his studio for his entire life. He continued to touch it up all the way up until his death. It is a large picture. It's 5 by 6 feet. You may recall, I mentioned a couple of exhibitions we've done here at the Turner show, but several years ago we did the Great Constable show where we had the 6-footers. Constable used to work on a sketch that was 6 feet, comparable in size and scale, 1-to-1 ratio to the finished painting. And they had never been brought together at the same time. And in that exhibition that we did, we brought them together so you could see the 6-foot sketch against the 6-foot painting. You could probably still find this on our website. When you look at our Constable of the White Horse, that's a 6-foot painting, right? That's a sketch. The finished painting is in the Frick. So those two would go together. Now, I mentioned going out and setting up shop. Here is Constable's paint box on the left that's kept at the Tate from 1837. And you can see, again, the bladders here of the paint, here other material. And then when we talk about a sketch box, that's what you see on the right, and that is one of Constable's wooden sketch boxes. That's what you would use as your support. You would close the box, put it on your lap, and then tack your paper to the top of the sketch box, and that would serve as your kind of support. Constable did not like to paint in gardens. He thought that whole thing was that's just silly. And he talked about gardens. He said, quote, "A gentleman's park is my aversion. It is not beauty because it is not nature." And even an English garden compared to a French garden, the English garden would have been more sort of wild and would grow, but still to him that was a whole artificial concept. Here is Constable's paint box again. It's without that little white sheet of paper that was in the previous image. You can see the bladders. On the right, that is not Constable's paint box, that's Turner's paint box. That was found in his studio after his death in 1851. These are kept at the Tate Gallery. We also have Turner's palette here on the left. And that's always interesting because you can see the colors that are on the palette. So when conservators did an analysis of the palette and about what was the color range he was using, and we have cobalt blue, emerald green, viridian, orange vermilion, barium chromate, which is a source for yellow. And on the right, what they found in his studio as well, Turner's studio, were all of these test tubes with dry pigments. There were over 60 that they found after his death. And these were the dry pigments that he would then use to make his paint. That brings us to Turner. And two of our great Turners that I've spoken about in the past, the junction of the Thames and the Medway on the left from 1807, and the approach to Venice on the right from 1844. Turner and Ruskin are very important together, and I'm going to come back to Ruskin in a few minutes. But the painting on the left is this sort of stormy scene. It's not derived from any biblical or historical or mythological story. It's a depiction of storm at sea, these ships that are floundering at the estuary where the Thames and the Medway meet. There's a lot of manipulation in this painting that is against nature. Where the light is, where the sun is, there's no way it could be shining on those sails based on where it is behind the clouds, all of this kind of stuff. He's taking a lot of liberties. So he is going for a grander kind of effect. But that sky in that painting by Turner is influenced by our painting of Rembrandt's Mill. This was the time that painting of the mill was in London, and Turner saw that picture in real life. And so it has an influence on Turner's skies, especially where there is a storm that's kind of passing. The painting on the right was a painting John Ruskin loved. And he called it, at one point, he wrote about it saying that it was, quote, the most perfectly beautiful piece of color of all that I have seen produced by human hands. That's quite a statement from Ruskin. So we have very sort of two different things here. Turner ends up almost creating purely abstracted landscapes of sun, light, atmosphere, color, and brushstroke. And the painting on the left is still Turner kind of looking at the Dutch. So the difference between Turner in 1807 on the left and Turner in 1844 on the right, he's traveled a great distance. Here is Turner's painting on the left, again, one of these long titles, Snowstorm, Steamboat off a harbor's mouth making signals in shallow water. That's the whole title from 1842. And I brought a painting in that we own. This is Turner's Evening of the Deluge on the right from the National Gallery from 1843. That painting, if you recall those two paintings I mentioned that were influenced by Goethe's theory of color, remember those? Our painting is probably the first tune-up, shall we say, for the painting that Turner did that was that one that was the hotter colors. So our Deluge probably relates to that earlier, to that painting by Turner that becomes part of that pair that explore Goethe's theory. If we take a little journey to Belgium, this is Jean-Michel Cels, he's in the exhibit, CELS. Cloud Study on the left from 1838 to 42. Sky Study with Birds, 1842. Cels is an important painter. He comes from Belgium. He actually is the son of a relatively well-known Belgian neoclassical painter. But his father introduces his son to going out and outside to do oil sketches. We don't know that much about his life, but he produces a really wonderful body of these cloud studies. It's interesting when you add something like birds into the sky. They're so small, but it does change the feeling. It does, when there's a human presence or an animal presence or something, or even, again, if there's a tree or something, it changes the whole feeling of the work. Here is Johann Jakob Frey. He's Swiss. Again, just note these nationalities. They're from everywhere, Belgium, Switzerland. This is sun breaking through the clouds above the Roman Campagna on the left from 1844, oil on paper from the National Gallery. That we own that painting. And then Frey's Sunset, 1840 on the right. It's in a private collection. Frey is Swiss, but he's part of this migration of artists to Rome and then moving southward through the Roman Peninsula, through past Naples into Calabria, ultimately into Sicily. And in fact, Frey travels ultimately to Egypt and to Ethiopia. He goes back to Italy. He dies in Frascati, just outside of Rome. Let's come back for a moment to Thomas Cole in a different vein. I showed you the Voyage of Life, two of the paintings, but this is a Thomas Cole drawing here on the left. It's titled Atmospheric Study with Notations from 1825. It's at the Detroit Institute of Arts. And this is a very important work because Cole studied and sketched and painted clouds throughout his entire life. from the earliest days, he was interested in the science of clouds, even if he often used those skies in a more symbolic way, as he does with The Voyage of Life. He was influenced by another book. It wasn't so much a meteorological text. It was a book called Precepts and Observations on the Art of Coloring and Landscape Painting from 1810. 1810 is the same year Goethe produces his theory. 1810 was interesting. There were a number of important treatises. On this atmospheric notation, he makes all kinds of notations of the shades of the clouds, the shape, the colors, what's happening as they come through this valley. And at one point, he inscribes on that the phrase thunderstorm after sunset. One of the paintings that Cole could never forget was the painting on the right by Constable. When Cole traveled to London, he was in London from 1829 to 31. He actually went into the studios. He was admitted to the studios of both Turner and Constable. And in Constable's studio, he saw Hadley Castle. That's the painting on the right, one of Constable's greatest pictures from 1829. And he could not forget that sky in Hadley Castle. That sky will be reworked, rechanneled in Cole's paintings over and over again. That painting is magnificent. We had it in our Constable show, and it was really something to see. Now, this is Cole, and one of arguably his most famous painting, perhaps, which has a long title that we never use in its entirety, The View from Mount Holyoke, Northampton, Massachusetts, After a Thunderstorm, but the title we always call it, because it's easier, The Oxbow, from 1836. This is the great Cole. It's at the Met in New York. And that's just a detail over here of the sky right in this area. So this is a detail of the clouds in the bigger painting. Cole took his cloud studies, just like Constable did, and then incorporated them into his larger pictures. But in fact, the inspiration for the Oxbow, for this whole sky scene here, is actually not Constable, it's Turner. It's Turner's Snowstorm, the painting I showed you with Hannibal, the army of Hannibal crossing the Alps. That's a painting Cole saw in Turner's studio. And he actually lifted the sky pretty much for his own painting. Here is a cloud study by Cole on the left, Clouds, 1830s. This is also at the Met. So that's a straight cloud study on the left. What I'm showing you on the right is not a painting by Cole. It's a painting by his greatest student, Frederick Church. And that's Sunset Across the Hudson Valley on the right from 1870. Cole, he did eventually master, much like Constable, the cloud study, and he passes that interest on to Church. I started this talk with a painting by Church from Maine. Cole and Church had almost a father-son relationship. Church idolized Cole. He was like a father to him. And in fact, in this picture here, when you look across the Hudson to the other side, he's actually painting the location where Thomas Cole had his house. When Church built his great house at Olana, he built it so that he could see Cole's house across the Hudson as a constant kind of homage to his great teacher. So both of these artists in American painting, Church and Cole, became great exponents of cloud pictures and cloud studies. Just heading back to the continent, a work that's in the show, this is a painter from France, Eugène Isaby, Fishing Boats Tossed Before a Storm, 1840. And another Frenchman, Gabriel Labasse, he's in the show, A Rocky Seacoast in a Storm from the 1840s. France has its own interesting history, and we can go back into our permanent collection and start to talk briefly about the painters that we come to call the Barbizon School at Fontainebleau. This is our great Troyon painting on the left, Constant Troyon, The Approaching Storm from 1849. This is a large painting. And then a smaller oil paint and black chalk on charcoal painting on the right by Troyon, that's also in our collection, A Windmill Against a Cloudy Sky. Troyon is one of the leading painters of what we will come to call the Barbizon movement. Prior to the French Impressionists, when these artists begin to move outside of Paris out to this is another exhibition we did a number of years ago, the School of Fontainebleau, which had been the hunting grounds for the kings in the past, the French kings. And they begin to move out into Barbizon to paint in the open air and to paint landscapes. The approaching storm on the left is one of the great paintings by Troyon that really is an homage in some ways to Constable. Certainly, again, he was thinking often of Constable in these pictures. Here is one of the other great Barbizon painters in our collection. This is Theodore Rousseau, Landscape with a Stormy Sky on the left. That's in the exhibition. That's this is a small painting from the Victoria and Albert. And then our great painting that came to us through the Corcoran collection on the right, After the Rain from 1850. Rousseau and Troyon are two of the great, most famous and most important of the open air painters that will paint in Barbizon. Now, we do have to say something about this guy because he's cast a huge shadow over the 19th century. He's so important. That's John Ruskin. So this is a portrait of Ruskin on the left from 1843. It's a print, but after a painting by George Richmond. And then on the right is a photograph of Ruskin as a young man from 1859. Last year, 2019, was the 200th anniversary of Ruskin's birth. There were celebrations all across the world of Ruskin, especially obviously in England. Ruskin is hard to sort of just summarize. He is the son of a prosperous wine shipper. He's born in London. His childhood could not have been more privileged and more devoted to his education. His father, John James Ruskin, imbued his son with a love of romanticism, with romantic literature, with the works of Byron and Shakespeare, Sir Walter Scott. His mother, Margaret, was an evangelical Christian who made him basically learn how to read by reading the entire King James Version of the Bible, front to back, and then reading it a second time after he had finished. Ruskin grew up almost being able to recite by memory entire chapters of the Bible that had been so sort of inculcated into him. It gave him a love of language, reading the King James Version, a love of imagery, a love of storytelling that would affect his writing for the rest of his life. He's essentially homeschooled by his parents. Occasionally they would bring in private tutors. He travels. His parents make sure that he travels. His father takes him on these literary pilgrimages, for example, to see all the various sites that were important to a writer like Sir Walter Scott. Here is Ruskin in 1863 on the left from the National Portrait Gallery in London, photograph, and on the right, a later photograph from 1885. Ruskin is, without a doubt, the most influential art theorist of the 19th century. There's nobody who comes close. Baudelaire is important in France, without a doubt, but Ruskin, the importance of Ruskin, the clout that Ruskin will have, the ideas of Ruskin just really do tower over almost everybody else in the 19th century. He's impressed by the work of Turner and almost single-handedly brings Turner to the sort of admiration of a broad public in Modern Painters. Modern Painters, it's 5 volumes, and most of it is devoted to singing the praises of Turner and clouds, both of those things. When you look at Ruskin's collected works, if you go to a library, not the internet, and you're actually looking at books on a shelf, there's one collected edition that everybody reads, edited by 2 men, Alexander and Wedderburn, and it runs to 39 volumes. Each volume is the size of an encyclopedia. The index runs to 688 pages, and the index is double columns. 688 pages, double columns, 39 volumes. Ruskin is the man who literally saves the Pre-Raphaelites when he defends them in 1848. Ruskin's writings what can I say? You have to read them. Some people hate Ruskin. I'm not one of those people. I really have a great admiration for Ruskin. He can certainly be stuffy and opaque at times. Clouds were something Ruskin had a fascination with his entire life. He writes passionately about clouds in Modern Painters. In Modern Painters, he declares that the sky is, quote, almost human in its passions, almost spiritual in its tenderness, almost divine in its infinity. he described himself as a sort of a cloud worshiper. He was an artist. This is a Ruskin drawing on the left, a study for Nice-Rock from 1853. This is where you can see why the Pre-Raphaelites were sort of supported by Ruskin, because Ruskin urged any artist to, much like we talked about with Leonardo, to use your eye. Look, and look again, and look closely, and take your time, and look again, and the closer the better. So when you look at all those Pre-Raphaelite paintings of little birds' nests and things, and every little twig is painted, and every little spot on the robin egg, and all of that, that's Ruskin. And then the question that usually befuddles people, okay, if he could support that, how can you support Turner? Turner's sort of deluge and atmospheric sort of craziness. Well, for Ruskin, they were both true to nature. They're just true to different aspects of nature. So he could equally support the Pre-Raphaelites as well as he could support an artist of such cataclysmic atmospheric effects as somebody like Turner. He read Luke Howard's study again on clouds. Everybody did, and Ruskin himself talks about three regions of clouds: the upper region for cirrus clouds, the middle region for cumulus, the lower region for nimbus. This guy, if you can have a love affair with a cirrus cloud, this guy did. He writes page after page after page about how perfect cirrus clouds are. He describes them at one point that they are, quote, motionless, multitudinous lines of delicate vapor. He goes on to say that they have, quote, narrow extremity, invariably turned to the wind, and the fibers are parallel with its direction. And that's just part of this kind of love affair with the cirrus cloud. Where you see this is if you go to modern painters. What I'm showing you here on the left is an illustration from modern painters that was based on a drawing by Ruskin. So Ruskin did the drawing, and then it was turned into an illustration to be printed in the volume 5 of Modern Painters. This is called Cloud Flocks. Cloud Flocks, it's cirrus clouds. On the right, and again from Modern Painters, again based on a drawing that's then turned into an illustration, the Venga Medusa. Venga Medusa is a term to describe a mountain peak in the Alps. And here's that idea of how the clouds relate to the peaks of mountains. Ruskin called this mountain, in fact, he named this mountain the Venga Medusa. That comes from Dante. And he described it as, quote, the most terrible. She is essentially the highest storm cloud, therefore the hail cloud or cloud of cold, her countenance turning all who behold it to stone. So the Medusa, this cloud is like a Medusa. You look at it, it's so terrible, you turn to stone. One writer on Ruskin and this topic of weather and clouds called this an example of the grotesque sublime, because he's so graphic about how he sees this. Ruskin is incredibly important as a teacher. His idea of pedagogy. He had many students through various institutions he was affiliated with. And he required his students to always undertake a daily period of going out into the open air, taking weather observations, and recording these weather observations in their notebooks. This is a Turner engraving. It's a Turner drawing that's then engraved here on the left, titled Coventry. And this is produced for the book of Turner illustrations called Picturesque Views in England and Wales. Before Turner is the Turner that we know, Turner was an artist who was what we call a picturesque artist, a topographical artist. He went out and actually recorded certain specific topographical places and views. These were compiled into a book, this one about England and Wales. So this is Coventry on the left. Here, for example, you see something I mentioned a long time ago, some church steeples, and some billowing stacks here from these factories. Here, this kind of juxtaposition. Turner was certainly reading Ruskin, there's no question about that. On the right is a Ruskin drawing. That's Ruskin. Light in the west, Beauvais, 1854. This would also be later engraved and would appear in modern paintings, but that is the original drawing by Ruskin on the right. Here is a Turner drawing, a watercolor, Longships Lighthouse, Land's End, on the left by Turner. And then on the right is another one of these engravings after a drawing by Turner, Stonehenge, from again, this was meant for this picturesque views of England and Wales. This drawing on the right, the drawing and then the subsequent engraving, was described by one critic or reviewer of the book that it appeared in as, quote, all its forms are marked with violent angles as if the whole muscular energy of the cloud were writhing in every fold. There's lightning striking, as you can see. Ruskin studied as an undergraduate at Christ Church College at Oxford. He remained proud of his connection to that school for his entire life and Oxford in general. He helped establish, as a matter of fact, the University Museum there at Christ Church College at Oxford. He was the first Slade professor at Oxford who delivered a series of important lectures every year to the students. He established a drawing school at Oxford, and that's what you're looking at here on the left, the classroom. He organized this school in 1871, and this was a school not intended solely for artists. Anybody could study. Men, women, artists, butchers. He thought everybody, this is very typically Victorian, he thought everybody should know how to draw. Didn't matter what your profession was, didn't matter what your education level was. And he said that that was important because as a result you might, quote, see greater beauties than they had hitherto seen in nature and in art, and thereby gain more pleasure in life. He was dedicated to this idea of a kind of universal education of drawing, again, so that, quote, so that my pupils may learn to love nature, unquote. When he assembled this drawing school, you see these cabinets on the right. They're file cabinets that are vertical cabinets. He assembled 1,400 works of art. Over 100 were works that he himself had created. Others were drawings by other people. They also created things like shells and various kinds of artifacts and objects that he then put at the disposal of his students so that they could learn from these things, they could look at these things and observe and make drawings. He essentially established, or at least was instrumental in the establishment ultimately, of a school of geography. Geography hadn't even been thought of as an actual separate discipline. Geology, yes, not geography. And so he had very much advocated that his students study maps, study landscape specifically in a kind of geographical sense. These are some of the drawings by Ruskin that he included in his kind of, in his cabinets for for his students to study. On the left by Ruskin, Study of Dawn, the first Scarlet on Clouds from 1868. On the right, Study of Dawn, Purple Clouds from 1868. These are both at the Ashmolean at the University of Oxford today. He's very much like Constable. He denotes on the backs of these exactly where he is, what he's looking at, what time of day it is, all of that. You remember I mentioned Valenciennes, who had said that one should work quickly and all of that. Ruskin was exactly in agreement. And he said that, he told his students, what is of essence when you work on plein air is speed. You have to work quickly. You have to try to achieve as quickly as you can the desired effect of the cloud as you see it. It's an exercise partly in visual memory. You should start the drawing in pencil very quickly. Then you can add color while your memory is still fresh. Once your memory begins to fade, you have to stop. Don't push it. Then just stop. So he advises his students, quote, rise early, always watch the sunrise and the way the clouds break from the dawn. Here's Ruskin's Study of Dawn at the left, White Clouds from 1868, and Ruskin's Autumnal Cloud Filling the Valley of Geneva on the right from 1862. These are both at the Ashmolean. On the back side of the drawing at the left, he writes the following: 20th March, 1868, very quiet, ended in soft rain. That's the inscription. One critic talking about this drawing when it was produced in a catalog of Ruskin's work described it as one of the most beautiful groups of clouds I ever saw. This is particularly interesting. This painting on the left is by Turner. Today, this painting is in Ohio. It is at the Toledo Museum of Art in Ohio. It's the Camposanto, Venice, from 1842. But that painting was owned by John Ruskin. And what Ruskin did on the right was to do a cloud study of this part of the painting. This is a Ruskin drawing as a cloud study for this part of the painting that he owned at that time and that ultimately found its way to Toledo. The drawing is from 1868. The Turner painting was from 1842. His rendering of that cloud and that whole sort of lifting from the Turner, Ruskin described that painting by Turner, which he loved, and he said, quote, "There's a bit of blue sky and cloud by Turner, one of the loveliest ever painted by human hand, but as a mere pattern of blue and white. He had better have painted a jay's wing. This was only painted, and is in reality only pleasant to you because it signifies the coming of a gleam of sweet sunshine in windy weather. And the wind is worth thinking of only because it fills the sails of ships, and the sun because it warms the sailors." That's the way Ruskin approached. I mean, he's empirical, but clearly he's imbuing these clouds with something much richer and deeper. Constable's response to Turner is interesting. Initially, Constable does not like Turner's paintings. He's not on board. But as he matures, or let's not say as he matures, as he gets older, he thinks differently about Turner, and later he comes to call Turner's paintings, quote, "golden visions, glorious and beautiful. They are only visions, but still they are art, and one could live or die with such paintings." He seems to paint the tinted stream, so evanescent and so airy. Initially, what Constable has problems with in Turner is that he seems to be too atmospheric, too loose, too lacking in the sort of empiricism. But ultimately, he comes to realize that that is, in fact, the greatness of Turner. Now, who's this guy? Well, just to sum up, this is Samuel Palmer, a painting called Oak Trees, Lillianstone's Park on the left from 1828. It's a pen and watercolor. That's at the National Gallery of Canada in Ottawa. And then on the right is Innishoram Garden. This is one of Palmer's most famous pictures. It's at the Victoria and Albert. Innishoram Garden from 1829. I bring in Palmer because not everybody liked Ruskin. Not everybody thought Ruskin was that hot. And in the case of Palmer, he's an artist who, even though he certainly knew Ruskin's writings, feels that what is more important in a landscape is the imagination, that you should bring an imagination to your landscape pictures. And what probably turned the tide towards imagination for Palmer was when he met, of all people, William Blake. As soon as he met William Blake, and he met Blake in 1822, Blake's whole approach to art was in his head. It was all about imagination. Blake was a visionary. He was hallucinatory. Some people think he was mad. But once Palmer discovered Blake, he changed towards a much more visionary kind of landscape. Blake had famously said at one point, there are lots of great quotes from Blake, but one of the greatest that I like is, he said, quote, "I can look at a knot in a piece of wood till I'm frightened by it." In other words, he could just look at a knot in a piece of wood and his imagination would turn it into some kind of monster or something, and he'd end up getting frightened by it. So Palmer seems to turn against Ruskin, and he writes, probably with Ruskin in mind. Palmer wrote in 1875, he said, quote, "Geological drawing is not art drawing. Though the latter includes as much of it as may be wanted, Claude and Poussin knew what to omit,
they addressed not the perception chiefly, but the imagination. And here's the hinge and essence of the whole matter. When he says the imagination is the hinge and essence of the whole matter, that's really somewhat of a rebuke to Ruskin. But trust me, you can't get rid of Ruskin that easily. This is Palmer late in his life. And he comes back to maybe have a rapprochement with Ruskin. This is Summer Storm near Polborough, Sussex on the left from 1851, and Harvesting on the right. This is a painting we own on the right. Harvesting from 1851. These are both watercolors. You sense when you see Palmer in the 50s, these are both 51, that maybe his interest in the sky and the clouds in these pictures, maybe he's somewhat embracing a slightly more naturalistic and empirical feeling that had come to him, or at least he was aware of from Ruskin. In conclusion, Gustave Courbet, we own these two great pictures. The Black Rocks at Trouville, 1865, and Camsey. These are both 1865 to 66. These are paintings, not small. These are oil on canvas. In France, Courbet was known as the painter of landscapes, and in the 1860s, he's focusing on these views of the Channel coast up in Normandy. And he has alongside him some young painters who are interested in what he's doing. One is Eugène Boudin, and the other is Whistler, and the other is Claude Monet. And they're all with Courbet along the Normandy coast, where he is experimenting and looking at weather and light and atmosphere and the water, and he's creating some incredibly great pictures. Black Rocks at Trouville is one of his greatest paintings. He called these paintings sea landscapes. And what he was hoping to do, and this made an impression on Monet, was to create a body of work along the Normandy coast that would be a series. So these were meant to be a series of pictures. Later, Monet would be famous for his serial imagery. So Courbet was, in essence, in some ways, giving permission to these younger painters in France that it was okay to paint landscapes as subject matter, to paint outside in the open air, and to paint in a very experiential but also very experimental way. Courbet is the master of the palette knife. And when you have to look at these in the gallery and you see the way he has encrusted these rocks with the palette knife. They were remarkably important paintings. Camsey on the right is a completely different feeling from the painting on the left. A different time, a different day, a different atmospheric and weather effect. And here again, thinking back to what we were talking about with Friedrich, but this kind of simple striation, sky, sea, land. These are modern, very modern paintings in that regard, ahead of their time. Finally, just to end with a question, can you have weather in sculpture? Well, the closest I can get is this. We own the sculpture on the left by Jean-Louis Ernest Massonnier, Horseman in a Storm, from 1878, where you sense a rider and a horseman trying to go up against the storm, the wind that's buffeting them. They're keeping their heads down, etc., moving against the storm. And then in a really remarkable sculpture that's at the Met, New York, Winter on the right from 1787 by Jean-Antoine Houdon. Here again, it's an interesting, when you think of portrayals of the seasons, spring, summer, fall, winter, so often they were allegorical. You would have Old Man Winter blowing and this kind of stuff. But what Houdon gives us is a woman who is shivering. She's trying to preserve her body heat from the cold. She huddles beneath this kind of inadequate shawl that she's wearing. She's in a chilled state. And to show Winter as a partially clothed girl marked a radical departure away from the more purely allegorical ways of representing the seasons. I know I've kept you well beyond your limits and tolerance. Go see the exhibition. I think you'll enjoy it. You have a lot of context now. So thank you very much.